single speech delivered in the calm halls of a global economic forum pushed the Middle East and Eastern Europe closer to a wider war, that question began circulating almost instantly after Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stepped onto the stage at the World Economic Forum in Davos and did something few expected. He openly confronted Iran by name. Not through careful diplomatic language, but with a blunt accusation that Tehran had drowned its own protests in blood, while simultaneously fueling Russia's war against Ukraine. For many observers, this was not just rhetoric, it was a calculated escalation. Why would Kyiv choose this moment in front of the world's economic and political elite to challenge Tehran so directly? And was this speech meant only as moral condemnation or as a strategic signal aimed far beyond Davos? Zelensky's remarks landed at a time when Ukraine's leadership had grown increasingly vocal about Iran's role in sustaining Moscow's battlefield capacity. From Kyiv's perspective, the connection was no longer abstract. Iranian-designed Shahed drones had become a nightly threat over Ukrainian cities, striking energy infrastructure, apartment blocks, and air defenses. Each explosion carried not only Russian intent, but Iranian fingerprints. By raising the issue in Davos, Zelensky reframed Iran from a distant Middle Eastern actor into a direct participant in Europe's largest war since World War II. What made the moment more explosive was its timing. The speech came amid renewed unrest inside Iran, reports of mass arrests and growing concern in Western capitals that the Iranian leadership was entering a more unstable and unpredictable phase. Zelensky's words cut into that vulnerability. He argued that if a regime could massacre its own citizens and survive, it would send a dangerous lesson to every authoritarian government watching. That warning resonated far beyond Ukraine's borders. At the same time, Washington's posture mattered. With Donald Trump currently in the White House, U.S. messaging toward Iran had hardened compared to earlier years. Sanctions enforcement was tighter, military deterrence more visible, and rhetoric less restrained. Zelensky's speech aligned neatly with that broader Western pressure campaign, even if Kyiv officially framed it as a response to battlefield realities rather than alliance politics. Analysts at several Western think tanks noted that this was not an emotional outburst, but a strategic narrative shift. By calling out Iran on a global stage, Ukraine sought to widen the moral and political costs for countries aiding Russia. It was a reminder to NATO members and undecided states alike that the war's supply chains ran well beyond Russia's borders. In that sense, Davos became an extension of the battlefield, one fought with words, legitimacy, and public opinion, rather than artillery. Yet the risks were obvious. Iran is not a marginal actor. It sits at the center of Middle Eastern power balances, proxies, and energy routes. Directly challenging Tehran could invite retaliation, not only rhetorically, but through expanded military cooperation with Moscow or pressure on Western interests elsewhere. Some diplomats quietly worried that Ukraine was opening a front it could not control. Still, Kyiv appeared willing to accept that risk. Ukrainian officials calculated that silence would be more dangerous than confrontation. As long as Iranian weapons kept arriving in Russia, Ukraine saw no benefit in restraint. Davos offered maximum visibility, and Zelensky used it to force a choice onto the international community: acknowledge Iran's role openly, or continue treating the conflict as if it were contained within Europe. Meanwhile, reactions began to ripple outward, from Tehran's angry rebuttals to cautious statements in Western capitals, setting the stage for a chain of responses that would soon extend far beyond words spoken in Switzerland. What followed next shocked analysts as attention shifted from speeches to the hidden machinery sustaining Russia's war. Why did Kyiv's accusations strike such a nerve in Tehran? The answer lay not in rhetoric, but in supply chains that had quietly reshaped the war in Eastern Europe. Long before Zelensky spoke in Davos, Iran had become one of the most consequential external enablers of Russia's campaign against Ukraine. While many countries cut Moscow off through sanctions, Tehran moved in the opposite direction, filling gaps that Russian industry could no longer close on its own. From the earliest months of the invasion, Ukrainian intelligence began tracking the arrival of Iranian-designed Shahed attack drones on Russian soil. These systems were inexpensive, easy to assemble, and devastatingly effective against energy infrastructure. Over time, their use evolved from sporadic strikes into a sustained pressure campaign aimed at blackouts, economic disruption, and civilian morale. For Ukraine, this was not merely Russian aggression. It was a hybrid assault made possible by Iran's technical and logistical support. How deep did that cooperation really go? And why did it matter so much at this stage of the war? Western defense analysts later confirmed that Iran's role extended far beyond deliveries. Iranian technicians were reportedly dispatched to Russia to help establish domestic production lines, allowing Moscow to scale up drone output despite sanctions. This shift transformed Iran from a supplier into a force multiplier. Russia was no longer dependent on shipments alone. It was learning how to replicate and adapt Iranian designs on its own territory, reducing vulnerability to interdiction. Missiles followed drones. Estimates cited by Western security officials suggested that Iran had transferred billions of dollars worth of ballistic missile systems components and related technology to Russia. Even where deliveries were limited, the strategic signal was unmistakable. Tehran was willing to challenge Western red lines if it meant strengthening its partnership with Moscow. For Ukraine, every missile strike reinforced the sense that Iran had crossed from indirect involvement into active participation. This cooperation had broader implications. NATO planners began reassessing the war, not just as a Russia-Ukraine conflict, but as part of a growing axis of sanctioned states pooling resources to offset Western pressure. The concern was not limited to Ukraine's battlefield. If Iranian weapons could sustain Russia under sanctions, similar models could emerge elsewhere, undermining the credibility of Western deterrence. At the same time, Iran's calculations were driven by its own vulnerabilities. Cut off from Western markets and facing internal unrest, Tehran saw partnership with Russia as both economic opportunity and strategic insurance. Energy deals, arms exchanges, and political backing at international forums created a mutually reinforcing relationship. Moscow gained weapons. Tehran gained leverage. Yet this alignment carried costs. By tying itself so visibly to Russia's war, Iran exposed itself to international scrutiny and potential retaliation. Ukrainian officials seized on this reality, arguing that Tehran could no longer hide behind plausible deniability. Each drone strike on Ukrainian cities became evidence presented not just to NATO capitals, but to undecided states weighing where they stood. Meanwhile, as Iran's involvement became harder to ignore, attention began turning inward toward the unrest simmering inside the country itself, and what sustained repression revealed about the regime's fears. What followed next shocked analysts as the focus shifted from foreign battlefields to Iran's streets and prisons. How far would a regime go to survive when it believes its grip on power is slipping? That question became unavoidable as reports emerging from Iran painted a grim picture of repression unfolding at home, while the leadership projected strength abroad. As Ukraine accused Tehran of sustaining Russia's war, Iran's streets were becoming another battlefield, one fought not with drones or missiles, but with fear arrests and mass executions. Could a government that claims confidence on the world stage be revealing its deepest anxieties through the violence it unleashes on its own population? Human rights groups and Western intelligence assessments began converging on a disturbing pattern. Protests that initially erupted over economic hardship and social restrictions were met with overwhelming force. Security units moved quickly, communications were throttled, and entire neighborhoods were sealed off. Estimates varied, but even conservative counts suggested that thousands were killed or injured within weeks. Tens of thousands more were detained, many without formal charges. At the center of this crackdown stood the authority of Ali Khamenei, whose statements framed dissent as an existential threat orchestrated by foreign enemies. Under that logic, protesters were no longer citizens, but traitors, a classification that stripped them of legal protections. Western legal experts noted that such language paved the way for summary executions under Iran's interpretation of religious law, bypassing conventional judicial processes altogether. The scale of repression startled even seasoned observers of the region. Analysts compared the pace of internal killings to casualty rates in active war zones, an analogy meant not to equate conflicts, but to convey speed and intensity. The message from Tehran was unmistakable. Survival of the regime outweighed all other considerations, including international image or economic consequences. This internal violence mattered far beyond Iran's borders. NATO policymakers began factoring domestic instability into their assessments of Iranian behavior abroad. A leadership under siege at home, experts argued, was more likely to act aggressively overseas to project strength and rally nationalist support. In that context, Iran's continued support for Russia took on a new dimension. It was not just strategic alignment, but also distraction and defiance. At the same time, cracks began appearing within Iran's elite circles. Reports surfaced of quiet disagreements inside the security apparatus as mid-level commanders questioned the sustainability of mass repression. Sanctions had already strained finances, and the cost of suppressing unrest was rising. Maintaining control required loyalty, money, and fear in equal measure, and all three were under pressure. Western intelligence agencies also warned that such conditions increased the risk of miscalculation. A regime that feels cornered may overreact to perceived threats, especially if it believes foreign powers are exploiting internal weakness. That concern resonated in Washington, where Donald Trump's administration emphasized deterrence while signaling that further escalation would carry consequences. Meanwhile, as images and testimonies filtered out despite censorship, global attention sharpened. Iran's foreign policy ambitions were now inseparable from its domestic crisis. The question was no longer whether Tehran could sustain repression, but how that pressure would shape its decisions in the coming weeks. Yet even as attention focused on Iran's internal turmoil, another set of signals was emerging, this time from military movements and diplomatic warnings across the region. What followed next shocked analysts as preparations hinted that words and repression might soon give way to direct confrontation. Were the quiet movements of ships and aircraft across the Middle East signaling preparation or prevention? That question began to dominate strategic briefings as a series of military deployments unfolded almost simultaneously, with rising diplomatic warnings. While public attention remained fixed on speeches and sanctions, defense analysts were tracking something more concrete: forces shifting into place at a speed that suggested contingency planning had already begun. Was this buildup meant to strike Iran, or to brace for what would come after the first blow? Regional tensions spiked after senior officials in Turkey publicly warned that intelligence indicators pointed toward a possible Israeli strike on Iranian targets. The statement was carefully worded, but its impact was immediate. Airlines began rerouting or suspending flights across parts of the Middle East, a step commercial carriers rarely take without serious security advisories. Markets reacted cautiously, and military planners moved from monitoring to readiness. At the same time, the United States accelerated deployments under the direction of Donald Trump, whose administration emphasized deterrence and force protection. A carrier strike group maneuvered closer to the region, accompanied by destroyers equipped with advanced missile defense systems. squadrons of fighter aircraft were repositioned to forward bases, while tanker activity increased, an unmistakable sign of preparations for sustained air operations rather than symbolic presence. Particularly notable was the movement of high-end missile defense assets. Systems designed specifically to intercept ballistic missiles were redeployed toward key locations, signaling concern not about initial strikes, but retaliation. Western military experts stressed that this posture aligned with long-standing assessments of Iranian doctrine. If attacked, Tehran would likely respond asymmetrically, targeting U.S. bases, Israeli territory, and allied infrastructure across the region. For NATO planners, the implications extended beyond the Middle East. An Iranian escalation could ripple into Europe through energy markets, refugee flows, and security commitments. Any disruption to shipping lanes or energy exports would immediately affect Western economies already strained by the Ukraine war. In that sense, the military buildup was as much about protecting economic stability as deterring conflict. Israel's position remained deliberately ambiguous. Officials neither confirmed nor denied preparations, maintaining a posture of strategic uncertainty. Analysts noted that this ambiguity itself served a purpose, keeping Tehran guessing while buying time for defensive measures. Meanwhile, Iran's rhetoric grew sharper, warning of severe consequences if its territory were struck, even as its domestic situation remained fragile. Western defense commentators highlighted a dangerous feedback loop. Military preparations, even defensive ones, increase the risk of misinterpretation. In an environment of mutual suspicion and compressed decision timelines, a single incident, real or perceived, could trigger escalation. That risk was compounded by Iran's internal unrest, which may have narrowed the leadership's margin for restraint. Yet beneath the tension, a paradox emerged. Much of the U.S. and Allied deployment appeared designed not to initiate war, but to control it, to shape the aftermath of an attack, rather than the attack itself. The goal, according to several retired Western commanders, was deterrence through preparedness, making clear that retaliation would be costly and ineffective. Meanwhile, as warships and aircraft moved into position, attention quietly shifted again, this time toward financial trails and personal exit strategies within Iran's elite. What followed next shocked analysts, as evidence suggested some senior figures were already planning for a future beyond the regime they publicly defended. If the leadership in Tehran projected defiance, why were growing signs suggesting that some of its most powerful figures were quietly preparing an exit? That contradiction moved to the center of analysis as investigative reports began exposing unusual financial flows linked to senior members of Iran's security elite. Behind the rhetoric of resistance, a different story was emerging, one told through bank transfers, property deeds, and carefully chosen safe havens. Were these simply isolated cases of corruption, or early indicators that insiders no longer believed in the regime's long-term survival? According to multiple sources familiar with regional intelligence assessments, large sums of money connected to Iran's Revolutionary Guard networks had been transferred abroad over recent months. The destinations were revealing Russia, parts of Central Asia, Turkey, and select Gulf-adjacent jurisdictions. Western analysts emphasized that such movements rarely happen by accident. They often reflect contingency planning by elites who expect instability, sanctions, escalation, or military confrontation. At the center of several reports stood Esmail Qani, a figure deeply embedded in Iran's regional operations. While Tehran publicly portrayed unity and discipline within its ranks, allegations circulated that funds intended for external operations were being siphoned into personal accounts and assets registered under family members' names. Properties in Moscow, luxury investments in Turkey, and commercial holdings across Central Asia were cited as examples of how sanctions could be bypassed through intermediaries. Western anti-corruption specialists noted that such mechanisms follow a familiar pattern. Assets are shifted into jurisdictions with political alignment or limited enforcement, often under the names of spouses or distant relatives. On paper, everything appears legal. In reality, it creates a financial lifeline, one that can be activated quickly if circumstances deteriorate. This mattered for more than ethical reasons. NATO analysts warned that elite capital flight often precedes political fractures. When commanders begin prioritizing personal security over institutional loyalty, it signals eroding confidence at the top. In Iran's case, that erosion was occurring alongside unprecedented domestic unrest and rising external pressure. The convergence was troubling. The strategic implications were stark. A leadership class hedging its bets is less predictable. Some figures may push for aggressive action abroad to secure relevance or bargaining power, while others quietly prepare to disappear into exile-friendly capitals. That internal divergence increases the risk of erratic decisions, especially in crisis moments involving Israel or U.S. forces in the region. From Washington's perspective under Donald Trump, these revelations reinforced a long-standing assessment: pressure works unevenly. Sanctions and isolation strain regimes, but they also incentivize corruption and self-preservation among elites. The challenge lies in managing the instability that follows. Meanwhile, Moscow's role loomed large. Russia appeared not only as a military partner, but as a potential refuge, a place where sanctioned figures could live comfortably under political protection. That dynamic strengthened the perception of an emerging network of authoritarian safe havens, complicating Western efforts to enforce accountability. Yet the most unsettling question remained unanswered. If senior insiders were preparing escape routes, what did they believe was coming next? As financial trails pointed outward, attention turned back to the regional picture, where multiple flashpoints threatened to converge into something far larger. What followed next shocked analysts as the war's separate threads, Ukraine, Iran, Russia, Israel, and the United States, began to tighten into a single volatile knot. Was the world watching separate crises unfold, or witnessing the early stages of a single expanding conflict? By this point, analysts increasingly argued that the lines between regional flashpoints were dissolving. What began as Russia's invasion of Ukraine had drawn in Iran as a supplier, pulled Israel into heightened readiness, and forced the United States and NATO to recalibrate their global posture. Each move now reverberated across multiple theaters at once. Could this interconnected pressure system hold, or was it approaching a breaking point? From Kiev's perspective, the war was no longer confined to trenches and missile defense grids. Ukraine's recent strikes on Russian energy infrastructure underscored a strategic shift targeting economic lifelines rather than purely military positions. Western military experts noted that these operations aimed to erode Russia's capacity to sustain long-term warfare, especially during winter months when energy demand peaks. The ripple effects were immediate: oil prices reacted, insurance premiums rose, and European policymakers quietly reassessed contingency plans. Iran watched these developments closely. Any successful Ukrainian model of energy disruption carried uncomfortable implications for Tehran, whose own economy depended heavily on energy exports and infrastructure resilience. At the same time, Iran's support for Russia tied its fortunes ever more tightly to Moscow's battlefield performance. If Russia faltered, Tehran risked losing both a strategic partner and a shield against Western pressure. Israel's calculus added another layer of volatility. Israeli planners faced a narrowing window between deterrence and action, particularly if Iran's regional posture grew more aggressive. The uncertainty was deliberate. By keeping intentions opaque, Israel aimed to complicate Tehran's planning and buy time for defensive preparations. Yet ambiguity also carried risk, increasing the chance of miscalculation in an already tense environment. For NATO and the broader West, The challenge was managing escalation without appearing passive. Under Donald Trump, Washington emphasized readiness and deterrence, reinforcing the message that retaliation against allies would be met decisively. At the same time, Western officials stressed the importance of avoiding a direct, uncontrolled confrontation that could spiral beyond anyone's control. Strategists described the moment as a convergence of stress tests. Russia's endurance under sanctions, Iran's internal stability, Israel's red lines, and NATO's credibility were all being tested simultaneously. None could be assessed in isolation anymore. A strike in one theater could trigger reactions across several others, transforming local decisions into global consequences. Yet despite the mounting tension, one reality stood out. No actor appeared eager for a full-scale war. Preparations suggested caution as much as aggression. Defensive deployments, financial hedging, and diplomatic signaling all pointed to a shared recognition of the risks involved. The danger lay not in deliberate intent, but in cascading reactions. As the week closed and global markets prepared for another cycle, analysts agreed on one thing. The system was under strain, and its next move would depend on choices made in moments of uncertainty rather than grand strategy. The final question remained open: are these pressures forcing a recalibration that stabilizes the system, or are they pushing it toward a conflict that no one truly